Hi. Slight altered arrangements. I had absolutely planned on doing The Hunter's Dream, and I did actually do quite a substantial amount of the episode already. But what's happened is I've got in touch with someone via Reddit who has agreed to translate some stuff from the original Japanese version of the game into English for me for the purpose of this series. Things like just some lines of dialogue and item descriptions and boss names and stuff. And a lot of this is very, very significant to The Hunter's Dream. So I'm putting off finishing The Hunter's Dream until I hear back from them. So for now, we're going to take a detour into Hemwick. Also, just a quick heads up that there is going to be one image of an actual dead human body in this video. It's not remotely graphic or anything like that, I just thought I'd mention it up front in case anyone is upset by that kind of thing. The Hemwick area is actually a lot larger than initial impressions suggest. The point at which we actually enter Hemwick is when we pass through this arch that's to the left of the Grand Cathedral. However, we don't get a title card or a lantern or anything until we're through this gate into the Charnel Lane area. This can create the impression, and it certainly created this impression in me, that Hemwick is the name of the Charnel Lane. So it's Hemwick Charnel Lane, as in a Charnel Lane that is called Hemwick. When in reality, the Hemwick area seems to be everything from that Hemwick Arch all the way up to the broken bridge that leads to Canehurst. So it's a Charnel Lane that is in Hemwick. So we'll start by looking at everything that leads from that archway up to the Charnel Lane gate. There's not much here except snipers and dogs, so you're not going to miss much if, like me, and I presume most people, you just made a dash through the area to the lantern as quickly as possible. But, as always, we can make a number of inferences from what's going on here. The most obvious thing is that outside of the gate defending Hemwick are all the men, whereas inside of Hemwick it's almost exclusively women, with the exception of some brick trolls and executioners and one old man in an attic. This is interesting to me because the women in Hemwick are just completely vicious. They have absolutely no problem just tearing you to pieces if you come near them. So it's not as if the women actually need to be defended. You could very easily just copy and paste these women into the hunting parties that we see around Yharnam, and they would fit in perfectly well, and this in fact does happen in Yahar'gul. And yet these mobs never have women in them. So what this says to me is that hunting seems to be something that men do and not women. Now, obviously this doesn't apply to the player character, because we can create a female character if we want. I'm not talking about hunters that are sustained by the dream, or what Redgrave calls pale blood hunters. I'm talking about the kind of civilian militia that have been raised to carry out beast hunts. It doesn't seem to be a compulsory thing for men, because we find all kinds of male NPCs who are inside and who aren't out hunting. But it does seem like there's something very gendered going on here, like the concept of what it means to be a man in Yharnamite culture is very, very bound up in the idea of picking up a torch and going out beast hunting. The idea that men go out hunting while women stay behind is further emphasized by the design of the women. While they do have bandages on, they don't appear to be suffering from any of the beast plague symptoms that we see in the male Yharnamites. They don't have the large canine teeth, they don't have the asymmetrical arms, and they don't appear to have any fur. They also attack you with tools rather than weapons. The hammer, sickle, fire iron, and not the Molotovs, but probably the oil in the Molotovs, do all appear to have a role in what goes on in the Charnel Lane area of Hemwick. So while the men we fight have consciously armed themselves with dedicated weapons, the women that we run into are just using their tools as improvised weapons. This leads into the other thing I want to talk about with regard to this area. The Hemwick area, not having a beast problem, has its hunters operate in a subtly different way. The Yharnamite hunters have to patrol the streets in groups looking for beasts, because beasts could be anywhere. Whereas if you're a hunter in Hemwick, the only place a beast can come from is from that arch that leads to Yharnam. So the way that this area is filled with hunters armed with rifles accompanied by sniffing dogs is actually the perfect way for Hemwick to deal with any beast incursions from Yharnam. Any beast that tried to make it through here would be sniffed out by the dogs, and once the dogs alerted the hunters, there's enough hunters that they'd simply be able to shoot the beast down before it got anywhere near the gate. So that about wraps up this area, and I now want to talk about the actual Charnel Lane. There's been a lot of confusion as to what precisely the charnel lane actually is, so I'm going to go through it in fairly exhaustive detail, starting with the name. Now, there is, as far as I'm aware, no such thing as a charnel lane. So, like a lot of people who played Bloodborne, I just assumed that, well, the charnel lane must be related to a charnel house. And there is this large structure in the distance where we ultimately end up fighting with the Witch of Hemwick. So I assumed that, okay, it's called the charnel lane because it's a lane that leads to a charnel house. A charnel house is a building in which bones are interred after the body has decayed. The purpose of this is that it prevents burial grounds from taking up too much space by reusing the plots. And as you probably already noticed, Yharnam is absolutely overflowing with graves. So it's not surprising that they'd want to free up space by having this extremely large charnel house. So the impression I got at the time was that there's simply so much death in Yharnam that this Hemwick village has kind of spontaneously grown up around the charnel house, and that it's inhabited by the people that work there and their families, in the same way that, villages will spring up around mines and factories. I no longer think this. I have a far better explanation for the village, which I'll come to later on. But for now, I just want to focus on the fact that this is clearly not a charnel house. The bodies that we find both in the larger Hemwick area and inside the presumed charnel house building do not appear to have been dead that long, as they still have skin and, very importantly, they still have eyes. The only bones that we find are the ones in the barrels in the Witch of Hemwick's boss room. Other than that, these corpses are still relatively fresh. What I would draw your attention to here are the corpses that we see strung up in the open air. Now, I thought, and I think a lot of other people thought, upon seeing these corpses, that this was just Miyazaki going, woo! But I think now this actually explains what the area is. It's not a charnel house, it's a charnel ground. A charnel ground is something that's a lot less familiar to Westerners than a charnel house is, so the confusion is understandable. A charnel ground is somewhere where you take the bodies of recently deceased people and you leave them out in the open. The body is secured either by putting it up somewhere very high or by tethering it to a post. The bones are then picked clean by scavenging animals, and in particular they're picked clean by carrion crows. And Hemwick is of course absolutely filled with crows. Not just the carrion crow enemies, but you can also see crows in the distance flying around, and they even get their own little scripted sequence as we first enter the gate. There's also one non-hostile crow that won't attack you. I left a message telling people to leave it alone, and it's been divisive. Because of the role played by carrion birds in this process, one of the names given to this method of disposing of corpses is sky burial. And if you've read Eileen's armour description, you'll know why that's significant. Hunters of hunters dress as crows to suggest sky burial. The first hunter of hunters came from a foreign land and gave the dead a virtuous native funeral ritual rather than impose a blasphemous Yharnam burial service upon them. There's also an entire area in Demon Souls that is designed thematically around sky burial, so it seems to be something that Miyazaki is interested in. You'll probably have noticed the contradiction here though, because we're specifically told that Yharnamites don't use sky burial, and yet that appears to be what's happening in the charnel lane. You'll notice I said that's what appears to be happening in the charnel lane. That's because I don't think that what's happening here is actually an intentional case of sky burial. I think that there's something a lot more sinister and blasphemous happening here, and that the name Charnel Lane is something that's come up perhaps colloquially to describe this place because there are so many bodies out in the open and it's filled with carrion crows. What I think's actually going on in this area is a combination of organ harvesting and cremation. There's a lot of smoke in Hemwick. It's coming out of the chimneys, but it's also collecting on the ground. The first time I played, I mistook this for mist that was hovering around the ground, but if you look, you can see that it's actually coming out of pipes that are embedded in the walls. And you can also see a kind of orange glow coming from a lot of the buildings around here. So the smoke appears to be being vented from these fires. And there is a lot of smoke coming out of these pipes, so I think it's fair to say that there's probably a lot of fires either underground or out of our field of view that's generating all of this smoke. If you get the monocular out, you can see that the Hemwick area stretches out far beyond what we actually get to explore, so there's probably fires in those places as well. In the area of Hemwick that we do explore, though, fire does play a very large role. Some of the women in Hemwick attack us with these extremely large fire irons. Now, as I said before, the women in Hemwick aren't using weapons per se, they're using tools as weapons. And given the heat that this thing is giving off, it appears that these women were tending to fires moments before we arrived. Also, if you look at the large statue in the Mound of Graves when you first enter the Charnel Lane area, it is holding the same kind of fire iron. There really aren't any other statues in this area, and this one is so huge and so prominent that it suggests that tending to fire is an extremely significant thing in Hemwick. Interestingly, this makes the women of Hemwick into firekeepers. Although as this is Bloodborne and not Dark Souls, nobody cares because it doesn't have blood in the name. There are also these jars of flammable liquid, which we see very rarely, and when we do, at least outside of the Chalice dungeons, there tends to be a significant reason for it to be there. The only place outside of Chalices where we find it other than Hemwick is Old Yharnam, and Old Yharnam was of course burned down, so it makes sense for there to be a lot of flammable stuff there. Its inclusion in Hemwick suggests that perhaps it's being used as a fuel for these huge fires that are burning. We also see these women throwing Molotov cocktails at us, which again I think is an improvised weapon. They've taken some of this flammable liquid and hurled it at us like a bomb. Something I'm less sure about, but I'm going to mention anyway, is this barn that's filled with hay. There are no living horses in Hemwick, but they keep a very, very well-stocked supply of hay, so it's possible that the hay is also fuel for these fires. I'm also reasonably sure that what's being burned here are corpses. We see a few of these kind of squat brick buildings that have a chimney attached to them, and they're clearly too small to be houses, but there's smoke coming out of them. But they are the right size for a human body to go in. We also see these little carts that are about the right size and shape to carry a dead human body, and we find one right near a dead body on a guillotine, which I think kind of confirms it. And the biggest piece of evidence is, of course, the bone marrow ash. According to the workshop, this is a special bone marrow ash collected from Hemwick Charnel Lane. So could cremation be the blasphemous Yharnam funeral that the original Hunter of Hunters was hoping to spare people? Probably not, because Yharnam is filled with regular graves, so cremation doesn't seem to be a common thing there. So this leaves us with two questions, namely, why are they cremating bodies in Hemwick, and what is so blasphemous about Yharnam burial? I think the first question is answered very succinctly by simply going to Old Yharnam, opening the monocular and looking at one of the smoking piles. They are piles of human bodies. Crucially, not beast bodies. We know that Old Yharnam was burned down to contain the last outbreak of the beast plague. The fire would obviously have killed off a lot of the beasts there, but it could also have functioned as a method of disease control. The burning of infected bodies is something that has happened during real-world plague outbreaks, and Old Yharnam doesn't seem to have been any different. But remember that Old Yharnam was very deliberately burned down and sealed off by the church, which suggests that they were also responsible for heaping together these bodies and burning them. So the church do seem to advocate the burning of bodies as a form of disease control, and the church have a presence in Hemwick in the form of these executioners. So the general impression I get is that the church are using Hemwick as a disposal site for bodies that they think may be infected, while other bodies, of course, are taken to Yahar Gul. The second question I posed was, what precisely about Yharnam burial is blasphemous? And I think it's the harvesting of organs. We find bloodshot eyes in a couple of locations around Hemwick, and obviously the Witch of Hemwick has collected quite a few herself. The description of the bloodshot eyeball says that it's removed quickly after death, or perhaps even before. So in order to get these eyes, the witches would have to get very, very fresh bodies. The eyeball-collecting witches are also present in Yahar Gul, which is operated by Mensis, who are part of the church. And while we're in Yahar Gul, there's a very interesting thing that happens when we rescue Adela. She thanks us, but then she gives us a madman's knowledge and says this.
It's sure to please an upstanding member of the church like you.
Now, she's not sharing insight with us in the way that Yosefka and Willem do. She's actually giving us the physical skull. And, taken in light of the way that Mensis are collecting all of these body parts to try summoning the One Reborn, there does seem to be a very strong implication that the church are harvesting organs from recently deceased people. It's also worth pointing out that the incense urns that the church used to keep beasts away are actually full of human bones, as if the bones are actually inside the urns slowly burning away, and that's the source of the incense. This is true of the urns in Cathedral Ward, the Erden Chapel, and the Upper Cathedral Ward. It's not true of the urns in Old Yarnum, but because Old Yarnum's been abandoned for so long, it's probably just that they've burned out. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the way that the Witch of Hemwick attacks us with what seems to be a lantern covered in eyes. This is, of course, extremely similar to the lantern covered in eyes that the church servants have, right down to using the same kind of arcane projectile. So there does appear to be a link between the Healing Church and what goes on at Hemwick Charnel Lane. So, dovetailing these two things together, I think I have a rough understanding of what happens at Hemwick Charnel Lane, an optional area that no one cares about. The Healing Church inspect the bodies of the recently dead in Yarnum. If the body is clean, then the church harvest its organs and either burn it in an urn to create incense, or just bury it. If the body, for whatever reason, needs to be disposed of specially, it's sent to Hemwick Charnel Lane. Once it gets to Hemwick Charnel Lane, there's no plans to actually bury it. Rather, it is left above ground until such time as it's ready to be cremated. It's then placed on one of these stretchers, doused in flammable material, and burned in one of these ovens. The remains are then sent back to the Healing Church as bone marrow ash. And both these methods of disposal are seen as blasphemous in the outside world. And now a quick look at the inhabitants of Hemwick. I already covered these women in detail earlier in the video, so I'll just give a quick note on what I think these tools are used for. The fire iron, as I said, would be used to tend to the fire. The hammer would perhaps be used to further grind the remnants of the bodies after cremation to get the ash to a certain consistency. The sickle would probably be used to remove flesh and organs from the body. And the Molotovs are simply the women improvising with the flammable liquid. The witch herself, there doesn't seem to be that much to say about. Everything about her design is quite obvious, and there doesn't really seem to be anything else to her. She's a witch, she collects eyeballs and sticks them to her coat. The tool she uses to remove the eyes with seems to be stylistically designed to look like a crow's beak. Given that eyes are one of the first things that crows go for on a dead body, this is obviously very fitting, and it suggests that perhaps crows have more importance to Hemwick than we realise. Since she has no real problems collecting eyeballs from people who are still alive and conscious, the way that she can turn invisible would obviously be a big help to her. I thought there might be some kind of folkloric basis for the witch, so I went looking, and the closest thing I could find was a Japanese monster called the Dodomeki, which is a female monster that's covered in eyeballs. The eyeballs aren't collected from other people, though, and the Dodomeki is described as a shapeshifter who takes the form of a very beautiful young woman, so I doubt it was a direct inspiration for the witch. There are also two witches, which will catch you off guard while you try to figure out which witch is which. Whether or not the witch has cloned herself, or there's simply two witches of Hemwick, is kinda up in the air. One of the things that's going to come up when I start talking about translation is that Japanese does not always specify if a noun is singular or plural. So the Witch of Hemwick's Japanese name, Hemuwiku no Majo, really just means Witch of Hemwick. It doesn't have a definite or indefinite article. So it isn't clear if we're dealing with the Witch of Hemwick who is able to copy herself, or we're dealing with a Witch of Hemwick and then, unbeknownst to us, there is another Witch of Hemwick in the same room. On the subject of the mad ones, I'm really just not sure. They spawn in the boss room if you have one or more insight, so if you go into the boss room without any insight, you won't have to deal with them. They also spawn in the regular Hemwick Charnel Lane area, but you have to meet two very, very specific conditions. It has to be after night has fallen, so after you've killed Amelia, and you have to have more than 15 insight. Since this area is available before Amelia, and it gives you access to the Carol runes, which are very, very helpful, most players are going to make a point of grabbing everything useful in Hemwick before they fight Amelia. The only reason you would go back here is after you got the Cainhurst summons, but unless you choose to spawn at the very first Hemwick Lantern rather than the Witch's Abode Lantern, you're not actually going to run across any of the areas where Mad Ones spawn. It's just a very odd decision that makes me think that there may have been something more to it in an earlier version of the game. I really like the Mad One's design, but the problem is that it's very, very simple, so there's not a lot to talk about. The way that the Mad Ones rise out of the ground is very reminiscent of the way that creatures summoned by Bell Maidens work. I'm thinking especially of the ones in Yahar Ghul, which appear to actually be made out of blood. This makes me think that the Mad Ones are an equivalent kind of creature, but one that's composed of either bone marrow ash or perhaps even smoke. They bleed this strange kind of black, oily substance, which actually looks a lot like the runoff you see in the pipes, leading from the presumed ovens. They could even be made from the residual blood that's in the corpses as they're burned. But yeah, there just isn't much to say about them. The presence of the sickles perhaps suggests that these are connected to the women of Hemwick, and that's probably true given that they inhabit the same area. But the Mad Ones have very androgynous bodies, so it's hard to tell if they're supposed to be male or female or have a sex at all. They may simply be nothing more than servants that the Witch of Hemwick has created to keep people away. So for the final part of the video, I want to talk about the area that extends from the gate that we open all the way to the Witch's Abode and the Broken Bridge, which I'm simply going to call Beyond the Gate. Strictly speaking, this area is not too different to the Charnel Lane area, but there are a few environmental details here that really fill in the history of the area and how it connects to Cainhurst. The first time I played this, I was very disappointed when I realised that while the Witch's Abode looks like a very large and complex structure from the outside, when you go into it it's really just 2 rooms and a staircase. And I am still disappointed in this. But I think I at least understand what's going on with it now. What we need to keep in mind here is that the witch or witches of Hemwick are basically squatting in an abandoned building. It's not designed for them and they're not making much use of it. It's simply a large empty area that they can store corpses in. And it's in an absolutely terrible state. So the real question is, what did this building used to be? If we go outside, we can see that the Hemwick area was at one point connected to Cainhurst via a bridge that's either collapsed or been destroyed. This is something that we can indirectly infer by just looking at this broken bridge, because there's really nowhere else it could have led. And we can also get direct confirmation using the Cainhurst summons. When the carriage from Cainhurst arrives, it comes in from where the broken bridge is, so it's acting as if the bridge is still there. You can very clearly make out Cainhurst from Hemwick, and you can make out Hemwick from Cainhurst. So it's safe to say that the 2 areas were connected in the past. And this appears to be the only way it was ever possible to get to and from Cainhurst Castle, which is isolated on a very small island. And apart from Cainhurst itself, there's nothing else on the island, which makes you wonder how the castle functioned. They have, for instance, these huge banquet rooms, but where would they have gotten the food from? Unless they traded everything for these Castle Cainhurst commemorative plates. I think the answer is that the Hemwick village was actually ruled over by the Cainhurst nobles, which means that the building the witches currently inhabit is likely either the manor owned by a local lord who ruled on behalf of Cainhurst, or perhaps a garrison where the Cainhurst troops were stationed. So, to me, it looks like when the executioners went to storm and destroy Cainhurst Castle, they would have had to come through Hemwick to do it. And if Hemwick was at the time overseen by Cainhurst, then it makes sense that the executioners would have completely destroyed the place as well. We even find executioners still roaming Hemwick. The executioners are also probably responsible for destroying that bridge just to make sure that no one can get to and from Cainhurst anymore. So having razed the village and murdered the aristocracy, the Healing Church simply turned the place into a dumping ground for corpses. And we have the mess it's in today. You can see in the witch's room there's this Pieta-style statue that is of a completely different style to the statue we see in the charnel lane. This to me suggests that that statue is part of the original architecture of the building and it's just been left there. Although the room does have these bandaged gargoyle faces that do seem to be consistent with the charnel lane statue, so the witches might be in the process of doing some redecorating. As for the corpse on which we find the rune workshop tool, I don't really see any indication that it's anything other than a corpse on which we find the rune workshop tool. There have been a lot of theories about who this is, whether it might in fact be Runesmith Carol, and that's entirely possible, but it could equally kind of be anybody. I'm not saying it's not anyone significant, it's just that there's no evidence that I can see that points to it being anyone in particular, so we can speculate all day about who we think it is. But without any kind of corroborating evidence, any theory you come up with is going to be as valid as any other theory. All we know for sure is that it's the corpse of a hunter who has the rune workshop tool and has had their eyes removed. The fact that they have a workshop tool suggests that at some point they visited the hunter's dream like we did. If they're dead though, that means the dream must no longer sustain them. So this looks to be one of our precursors who, for whatever reason, after Gurman freed them from the dream, went back to Hemwick and were captured and killed by the witch. As the runes are heavily associated with Bergenworth, it's possible that this hunter picked up on the whole lining your brain with eyes to gain insight thing and came to Hemwick because it's the place you'd go if you were looking for eyes. Though they could equally have been looking for Canehurst, although they could also have just tried to leave Yarnham through the Hemwick Arch and ended up here in a dead end. Well, that was not as long as last time, but still very long. The translation is coming along quite smoothly from what I can see, so the Hunter's Dream should be up soon.